So as we begin to think about 4 different theories of persuasive communication, I want to begin by distinguishing those 4 theories into 2 categories. First, we'll talk about pre-decision theories, and secondly, we'll talk about post-decision theories. Now, when I mean pre-decision theories, I'm talking about theories that would help us understand or explain why somebody would make the decision they do, in which ways their behaviors would be influenced, and how their attitudes might change as it leads up to making that decision. As we think about post-decision theories, we're talking about something like perhaps after you've purchased an expensive car, what research are you doing to convince yourself that was a good idea, and for what reasons might you be doing that? In that sense, that's a post-decision theory which attempts to explain the behaviors people have made after they've already made them, or after their attitudes have been influenced to do so. As we begin to think about those different theories of persuasion, I want to distinguish the first pre-decision theory as social judgment theory. When we think about social judgment theory, it's important to acknowledge that it has 4 distinct assumptions that help it build its worldview. Remember, we talked about how all theories have assumptions which precede things like the concepts that help us understand the way that it views the world around it. And so this particular theory suggests that by knowing a person's attitude or understanding the way a person views the world, we can adopt our messages strategically and otherwise be more likely to influence somebody if we know their perspective or opinion on an issue beforehand. It also suggests that people make their decisions not only based on pre-existing messages, but also on their own pre-existing attitudes or how they feel about an issue based on all the things, or an idea, based on all the things that have led up to it prior to it being introduced by the speaker. In this sense, we believe, in thinking about social judgment theory, that attitudes exist along a continuum, from otherwise being very acceptable attitudes and things that would easily persuade us, to things that are less likely to persuade us and farther on the scale or the continuum of rejection. People who think about social judgment theory often argue that persuasion can only happen if we can move somebody along that continuum from non-commitment closer towards acceptance of an idea. A good example of where we might struggle to do this is perhaps I'm left-handed. You're not going to be able to persuade me to become right-handed. That's in my latitude of rejection. It's too far down the continuum for me to even think about accepting. However, perhaps you can tell me information about left and right-handed people and get me to try to be more right-handed by practicing a musical instrument with my right hand or by drawing with my right hand occasionally to sharpen my mind. Well, perhaps in doing that, you might move me from a latitude of rejection toward one of non-commitment or even of acceptance. This is something that social judgment theorists might start to theorize. So as social judgment theory positions this idea of a continuum, it suggests that people locate themselves along various different anchor points of belief. You already heard my anchor that I'm left-handed, and so perhaps that makes it less likely to move me along that continuum towards accepting switching hands to be right-handed dominant. When we think about anchors, these are a way to describe the attitudinal stance you might have towards something and how strong it is or how unlikely it is to move along that continuum. The farther an anchor is from the center, the more likely it is that it will require you to have a considerable amount of persuasion to move you in that anchor. When we talk about that, that's because we believe in social judgment theory that individuals who have firm anchors have high levels of ego involvement. Now that's not to be rude to those who would otherwise assume the negative about the ego. That's to suggest that it's meaningful to you. It has a strong core connection to you, and as a core connection to your identity, you're more likely to defend it or want to know more about what the speaker is saying before you accept their ideas. When we think about this continuum, moving somebody from the latitude of non-commitment to the latitude of acceptance requires being able to know their pre-existing attitudes and think reflectively about the best ways to tailor your message. We've previously described this process of tailoring your message as strategic discourse. It might be helpful to think a little bit more about what we mean when we talk about something like ego involvement. When we talk about ego involvement in the context of social judgment theory, we're suggesting that the more an ego is involved, the more the issue is perceived as important to the individual who's hearing that speech. Indeed, ego involvement suggests that you're more likely to hold intense positions. Perhaps you can think about somebody who has a very extreme political viewpoint or otherwise has a tendency to believe in conspiracy theories. Presumably, these individuals have high ego involvements as it relates to those issues. Perhaps you yourself have high ego involvements about which cars are the best to drive or which candidates are the best to vote for. Certainly having high ego involvement is not a negative thing. Having high ego involvement simply means you're more likely to process that argument in a way that requires you to be moved by significant evidence. In this way, the issue is central to your sense of self. People who have higher ego, according to this theory, are more likely to have a larger attitude towards rejection, or a bigger continuum of rejection than a continuum of acceptance. You're going to have to say exactly what they already believe and like in order to get them to accept your premise. In that sense, the latitude of acceptance narrows. These individuals also have a much smaller area of non-commitment because they're already invested in the issue. Perhaps you have strong opinions about which candy bar is best, and you're at a gas station and your friend tries to tell you to purchase a different candy bar. The likelihood that you'll switch is diminished. Your commitment has narrowed, and your decision to purchase the one that you have wanted has increased. Again, social judgment theories here are making explanations and predictions based on behaviors and attitudes. There's also a unique phenomenon in social judgment theory whereby we've observed that if you push somebody too hard to accept an issue, perhaps going back to the idea of getting me to switch to become right-handed dominant, individuals in the audience will actually backlash and end up opposing your premise or proposition solely on the grounds of being sick of hearing it shoved down their throats. This is known as the Boomerang Effect, or otherwise pushing listeners to accept an idea so vigorously that they backlash and oppose your ideas even more than they had originally. Indeed, if you continued to tell me that I should switch from left-handed to right-handed the whole time, I might begin to think that right-handed people were pushy or bully. Of course, that's not true, but given incessant pushing towards me, that boomerang effect would be a risk that a persuader would be willing to run. There's also another effect in which there's an assimilation effect, or individuals try to minimize differences between their message and the position of others around them in order to make their anchors more compatible with friends, with family, or with others they care about in their social circle. We've also seen an opposite effect, or the contrast effect, happen when individuals subconsciously exaggerate their differences from others in order to make their own position appear more unique, more novel, more controversial, or more acceptable in a social circumstance in which it's being challenged.